This has got to be the shortest wait in between videos I've ever done. Welcome to the second part of Aquatic Biomes. We're going to focus on salty stuff now. So get ready. We're about to get salty. And yes, I had to make that pun. So we're going to talk about marine biomes. Marine biomes have salinity ranges anywhere from brackish, remember that's kind of salty, to briny, which is very salty. The largest part of it is going to be the open ocean. It's the largest volume, but it usually doesn't tend to have the most living things. Some of the areas that we're going to look at, or the zones, are very similar to the names we saw in lentic areas. So benthic zones are the bottom. Include some sediment. It is, going to be very nutrient rich. Photic zones are where light can get through, and that's where photosynthesis happens. Aphotic zones are deeper than that, and there's very little photosynthesis. Instead, the ecosystems will depend on decomposing any falling organic matter. So that's dead bodies and body parts. I know, tasty. That's supposed to be a Y. Or in some cases, you'll have a process called chemosynthesis. Notice its similarity to photosynthesis. You're still making sugar, but instead of using light as your energy source, you're using chemical energy instead. So let's take a look at the ocean. You can divide it up by a couple of things. You can divide it up based on light penetration. So you've got your sunlight zone or your photic zone. You've got your twilight zone. No, not the TV show, where you have less light, and it's also an area where you don't have enough light for photosynthesis, but you still have some visibility. And then you have the aphotic zone, which is no light whatsoever. You can also divide up the zones by kind of depth, how close they are to shore. So here, remember, we talked about our intertidal zones. You also have, bordering most oceans, a region called continental shelf, which is shallower water, so that's going to have a lot of photosynthetic life there. Then you have the continental slope, which is where it starts getting deeper much faster. And then you can have the abyssal regions. The abyss is very deep, and even deeper than that, you have trenches. If you've seen the Aquaman movie, they talk about trenchers. They live in the trenches super, super deep. And because light is so important for the basis of a food chain, that dependence on light tends to limit most organisms to the top layer. However, remember, you also need nutrients. And unfortunately, out in this open area, notice you stop having photosynthesizers. These are kind of the photosynthesizers. And that's because they're close enough to the bottom that they get nutrients. They also get nutrients coming in from the land, and they also have light. Out here, you have no photosynthesizers because there's low nutrient levels. Coral reefs are the first of the biomes within the ocean that we're really going to look at. These are large structures usually built of the exoskeletons, so the outer surroundings, of coral polyps, which is the name for the organism. They're usually shallow. They have to be in shallow areas because coral has a relationship with an algae, so it needs to be in an area with photosynthesis, and it's usually in warmer waters, but they're very fragile ecosystems. Even though they have a ton of biodiversity, a ton of species living there, if the temperature goes too high, it definitely kills them. So if you have heard of coral bleaching, that's something we'll talk about with global change and climate change in Unit 9. And this map is just showing you some areas with some of the major coral reefs. For example, you've got the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. You've got some coral reefs in the Caribbean right here. You notice they're not going to be out in the open ocean just because it's not shallow enough for them to get light. So this is a coral polyp, like what I was talking about. They built a hard skeleton around them, and even when they die, new corals come in and start building on top of those. So this is dead coral remains. but it forms this great foundation for other corals to grow on top of. So they have this hard outer shell, but they stick out these tentacles, and they use that to grab food, and also to make sure nothing's like landing on them. So they do have a mouth, but they don't depend completely on what they can eat. Instead, they have algae. They have photosynthetic algae that live inside of their tentacles, live inside of their body, and they have a mutually symbiotic relationship. The algae is going to get nutrients from the polyp, which it gets by digesting things, and then the polyp gets sugar made by photosynthesis, which is also why these guys have to exist in shallow water, because without the photosynthetic algae, they die. So, moving a little closer to shore, we also have some marshlands that are salty. So these could be like saltwater marshes, and they are in areas where you have water that's brought in by tides. So notice this GIF, you have the water level rising, and so these areas are submerged part of the time, but then when there's low tide, they tend to be exposed. And here you see kind of a side view so you can see the level of the water. They're found a lot of times in and around estuaries, which we'll talk about in a moment. And they're really important. They do a few things that are very important. They protect shorelines from erosion, so they keep the ocean from eating away the land. They'll reduce flooding, and they protect water quality. And we'll get into more details about that later on. A specific type of kind of marshland is a mangrove forest. These are trees that are very unique. They can grow in salty water. If you take any other tree and you try and grow it in salt water or water it with salt water, it will die. But these guys are adapted to live in salty water. So they live in brackish or saline water along the coast. And they also have these really complicated series of roots. So their roots kind of look like they're out on stilts. And so they'll be exposed some of the time. Notice there's an intertidal zone here. So at high tide, they may be completely submerged, the roots at least. And at low tide, they'll be exposed to the air. These forests are very important. They stabilize the coastline and reduce erosion just like the marshlands do, but also all those roots and kind of this tangled web of them are a very great shelter for organisms to hide from predators. It also provides a food source, so these are very productive ecosystems. Here we have a diagram that shows you the location of a lot of mangrove forests as well as a lot of salt marshes. So notice the mangrove forests tend to be in the more tropical and subtropical areas, and the salt marshes tend to be in the more temperate areas. You'll also notice these guys hug the coast, and unfortunately, where do a lot of people like to live? On the beach. So when we talk about global change, we'll talk about also land use, and we'll talk about how that impacts these ecosystems. So I mentioned estuaries. Here is kind of my diagram of what an estuary looks like. It's an area where a river enters the ocean. It's kind of going to be some semi-enclosed area, so notice it's not straight up to the mouth of the river like the ocean boundary. It's going to have brackish water, so it's going to be kind of salty. It's got a lot of nutrients, a lot of sediments from the river dropping them off, which means it's going to be highly productive, lots of plant life, very important ecosystems, support diverse communities, and you'll also find marshes and such in kind of that same area too. Before we move on to the next thing, I just wanted to give you a reminder about photosynthesis. It's probably been a while since you've looked at the equation for it. Notice the two things you need for photosynthesis are CO2 and water. If you're a water organism, hey, you've got plenty of water surrounding you. But what can limit the rate of photosynthesis is CO2. And then at the end of photosynthesis, what do you produce? Well, you produce oxygen. And that's a big deal as well, because let's take that back. Most organisms use oxygen, including plants, including producers. They make oxygen, yes, but they use it too. And so that's kind of important to think about, because when you don't have enough oxygen, you can't support other organisms. When you don't have enough carbon dioxide, you can't support enough producers. So there are actually a lot of photosynthetic organisms living in the ocean. Marine algae, including seaweeds. You also have things like this guy right here. This is a phytoplankton. It's a tiny little sea creature that performs photosynthesis, and they produce a lot of oxygen. They perform a lot of photosynthesis. So they can take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's thought that they're the reason why climate change isn't worse than it is already. 50% to 80% of the O2 produced on the planet comes from these guys. Comes from these photosynthetic things swimming in the ocean. Though don't go out there and be like, oh my God, I gotta go thank the algae for making my O2. A lot of the O2 they produce is then used by the marine organisms that surround them. All right, so now we're going to talk about how some of these non-mineral marine resources are distributed, and for that, we're mostly going to focus on fish. But before we do that, let's talk about a range of tolerance. All organisms have a set of environmental characteristics that they're like, this is where I want to live. It can be a range of temperature. If you're living in the water, it could be a range of salinity. It could be a range of pressure. And you have this, what's called an optimal range. That's the best place for you to live. Once you start getting further from that, so let's say this was temperature. High temperature, once you start getting to higher temperatures, it's what they call the range of physiological stress, meaning it's not good. You have less organisms living there because it's not good for them. And then once you get too high of this, say we're looking at temperature here, it's called the range of intolerance. They can't live there because it kills them. So for example, if you have a set of fish that have this temperature range that is best for them to live at, and the water temperature rises, then these guys are going to die. Similarly, the same thing happens on the other end of the spectrum. It can get too cold for some fish, cold enough to kill them. So a change in any direction can be bad. But this also will help you figure out where an organism's located. So some of the things that affect where the fish are distributed are going to be things like salinity, depth, something called turbidity, how much nutrient is available, as well as the temperature. And turbidity is something we haven't talked about yet. It's how clear or cloudy the water is. So if you have low turbidity, that means you have less stuff in your water and it's clearer. If you have high turbidity, that means you have more stuff and it's kind of dirty or cloudy. Another thing I wanted to point out is, remember upwellings where you have kind of nutrients being taken up by currents. So you have water rising towards the surface and it's pulling with it various nutrients. This is nutrient rich. It's in the photic zone. I do not know why they're meowing. And it also has high dissolved oxygen, meaning that this is going to be a very good area for living things. You'll have a lot of producers here, and those producers will then end up supporting a whole ecosystem. So here is a kind of map that I found that looks at fish catch, so fishing worldwide. You'll notice that kind of red outlines of countries. Those are the regions by like kind of international treaty where they have the rights to all the fish in those waters. The green is showing where like most of the fishing is done. And it's also labeled by like countries and how much fish they catch. But you'll notice a lot of it tends to happen along the shoreline, and that's not just because it's, closer to us, but it's also because those are nutrient-rich waters with shallow water where you can have photosynthesis. Notice this area that's not quite on a shoreline, that's a major area where you have some upwelling. And that's why you have those highly productive areas where fish can live. All right, that is it for aquatic biomes. I will see you for biogeochemical cycles later.